The Apostle Paul expresses his desire to go to Spain twice in the letter to the Romans. Technically, the word is Hispania in the Greek and Latin. It was the word used to refer to the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain would eventually be located. But the last we hear about Paul is in the book of Acts, which tells us he made it to Rome and was there for 2 years, after which the story of Paul abruptly ends. Tradition says that he was beheaded in Rome under Nero, but we have no evidence of this. This is unfulfilling to say the least, as we are left with no closure for our Pauline protagonist. We just don't know if he made it to Spain or even how he died. Furthermore, New Testament scholar Joshua Schachterle tells us that most scholars place the date of the writing of the book of Acts between 80 and 90 CE, and Schachterle himself places the death of Paul between 64 and 68 CE. This means the book of Acts was written after the death of Paul. So why not include his death? Why not finish the story? We may be able to solve all of these mysteries by taking a closer look at the clues hidden in the book of Acts. To do that, we'll need to focus in on Paul's voyage and shipwreck on his way to Rome. Paul Davidson has written an excellent article entitled On the Plausibility and Purpose of Paul's Sea Voyage in Acts 27. In it, he lays out some of the oddities and absurdities found in the shipwreck narrative of Acts. For the most part, the voyage is fairly plausible, but once they leave Crete and head into the storm, some details are historically problematic. The storm rages on for many days. Ultimately, we learn it's 14 days, with thick clouds blocking the sun and stars. This presents a challenge as the Grigel, a strong northeast wind that sometimes blows in the eastern Mediterranean, is uncommon, typically occurring in October only once every 2 years or so. Moreover, this northeasterly wind generally lasts only a day or two. No record exists of it persisting anywhere near 14 days. Regarding the cargo, in this case grain, it's improbable that the crew could have opened the hatches to remove the grain during a rainstorm. Some scholars believe only the baggage on deck was jettisoned, while others suggest that the author may have borrowed this detail from the story of Jonah. Further complicating the issue, Acts 27 verse 38 later describes the wheat being thrown overboard seemingly again to lighten the ship. During the storm, the crew of the ship attempt to escape on the lifeboat. Commentators have noted issues with the sailors' attempted escape, which Paul prevents. Objections include, the captain and owner would have likely known what the sailors were doing, and no sailor would risk leaving an anchored ship to navigate a dangerous coast in a lifeboat at night. One commentator argues that abandoning the ship under such conditions would be absurd, a notion only non-sailors might suggest. This event involving the lifeboat is interesting from a propaganda perspective. In most cases, these types of convoluted stories are an attempt by the author to explain an event that happened while leaving out part of the story he didn't want to include. In this case, perhaps the lifeboat was discovered after the storm, maybe even with the crew on board. If that was the case, then this part of the narrative is an attempt by the author to explain why the lifeboat was discovered. Eventually, Paul and everyone else on the ship survive and land on the island of Malta, where Paul survives a bite from a viper. The problem with that claim is that Malta has never had any poisonous snakes, nor are any found there today. Landing at Malta presents a significant issue, as Malta lies about 540 miles from Crete, a distance difficult to cover by chance. With no navigation possible due to lack of sun or stars, and only a small foresail, it's unlikely the ship could have intentionally or accidentally reached Malta. The odds of hitting this small island in the open sea rather than the mainland are highly improbable. So, if the shipwreck narrative is improbable, that leaves a big gap in the story about Paul. What really happened after they left Crete? If we take out the landing at Malta, we are left with just a shipwreck, and the likely death of Paul. That is to say, Paul not only never made it to Spain, he never even made it to Rome. Furthermore, he may have died even without a chance to survive in the sea. In Acts 27, verses 42 through 44, it says, "The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from accomplishing their intention, and commanded that those who could swim were to jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest were to follow, some on planks and other various things from the ship. And so it happened that they all were brought safely to land." If this was an invention of the author, then Paul was likely killed with the rest of the prisoners, as the crew and Roman troops prepared to save themselves. The implications of Paul dying in a shipwreck would have been even worse in the ancient world, as it would have had theological implications. Ancient Greek beliefs tied shipwrecks and sea misfortunes to divine punishment for guilt. Hellenistic views held that disasters, particularly at sea, were divine punishments for the wicked, and that even the innocent could be tainted by their association with the guilty. Perhaps the narrative had grown up around the shipwreck about the twin gods and patrons of sailors, Castor and Pollux, exercising judgment on Paul, and that is why the author of Acts includes the twin brothers as the figurehead of the ship that took Paul from Malta to Rome. You can see why the author of Acts would have wanted to remove such implications from the narrative. It would have been devastating not only for Paul's reputation, but for the Christian community he founded as well. The author can't deny the shipwreck took place because it was too well known, but he could spin it in a more favorable light. Paul's survival of a shipwreck and a snakebite, and his prediction that all aboard would be spared, would have signaled divine favor and innocence, rendering an earthly trial in Rome unnecessary. This also explains the abrupt ending in the story of Paul in the Bible. As a propagandist, the biblical author is reluctant to add more to the narrative than what's needed, and in this case, he spins the story just enough to get Paul to Rome. And if you want to know the real reason why Paul was sent to Rome, be sure to check out my video, Was the Apostle Paul the Egyptian? Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.